was alone on my sailboat, 3 days out from the California coast, when the radio static first formed words, not the crisp, professional voices of other sailors or Coast Guard, but whispers, barely audible beneath the white noise.
James, come deeper.
I nearly dropped the coffee mug I was holding. Nobody had used my name on any broadcast. I switched frequencies, but the whispers followed, growing clearer.
We're waiting, James. Come to us.
I shut off the radio, convincing myself it was just crossed and signals or exhaustion playing tricks. That night, I dreamed of dark water and pale hands reaching upward. The next morning, I found wet footprints leading from the edge of my boat to the cabin door, small, like a child's, but oddly shaped with too many toes. They vanished halfway across the deck. The ocean was calm, an unsettling mirror reflecting clouds that didn't move. That afternoon, my GPS began malfunctioning, and the coordinates flickered between my actual position and the location 200 miles west, deeper into the Pacific. Each time it jumped, the water around my boat darkened slightly, as if a shadow passed beneath the surface. I tried the radio again, desperate for human contact. Instead of standard emergency channels, I found only that whispering voice, now joined by others, a chorus of soft, waterlogged voices repeating my name.
We saved a place for you, James. We've been waiting so long.
That night, a storm rolled in without warning. Howling wind and waves battered my small craft as I fought to maintain control. Lightning illuminated the water in brief, terrifying flashes. During one such flash, I saw them. Dozens of pale faces watching from the water, their eyes following my movements as the boat pitched and rolled. When the storm cleared, I found myself off course, pulled westward toward the coordinates that had been flickering on my GPS. The sun seemed dimmer here, the sky a strange greenish grey. My compass spun uselessly, and the depth finder showed impossible readings. One moment 600 feet, the next 6,000, then off the scale entirely. I tried to turn back, but the engine died. The wind vanished. The sea became glass, and I noticed the water around my boat was changing color, darkening to deep violet, then black, like ink spreading through water. The surface remained glassy smooth, but the blackness seemed to have depth, to be looking back at me. A hand reached out of the water, pale, waterlogged, adult-sized this time. It gripped the side of my boat, followed by another, then dozens more, appearing silently from the black water. Their heads emerged next, men and women with seaweed tangled in their hair, skin bleached by salt and sun. Their eyes were black pools, their mouths stretched in welcoming smiles that revealed fish bones caught between their teeth. "You've been broadcasting to us for years, James," said the nearest one, a woman with a gaping wound where her throat should be. "Every night in your dreams, calling us to find you." I backed away, but there was nowhere to go. They were surrounding the boat now, their combined weight making it list dangerously to one side. "We need a new voice," said another, water spilling from his mouth as he spoke. "Yours is perfect, young, strong. It will carry across the deep places." "I never called you," I whispered. But even as I said it, memories surfaced, childhood nightmares of drowning, a recurring dream where I walked into the ocean calling names I didn't recognize. "You've always been one of us," the throat wound woman said. "Just not yet." They began to sing then, a strange melody that made my ears ache and my vision blur. I recognized it somehow, The same song I'd been humming to myself for days without realizing it. The black water began to rise the sides of my boat, not as waves, but as a single unified mass. It flowed over the edges, across the deck, deliberate as a living thing. Where it touched, the boat dissolved, not splintering, but simply ceasing to exist. As the darkness rose around my legs, I felt a sense of homecoming. The drowned choir song grew louder, and I realized my voice had joined them, calling new travelers to the deep. My last coherent thought was that I should be afraid, but all I felt was the pull of the abyss and the knowledge that soon I would be the voice in someone else's radio, calling them home to the darkness beneath the waves. They found my boat 2 weeks later, perfectly intact but empty. The GPS was still functioning, showing coordinates that didn't exist on any maritime chart. The radio plays nothing but static, unless you listen very closely late at night when the whispering begins. The research vessel Demeter was 16 days into a 20-day expedition when we discovered the anomaly, a perfect circle of unnaturally warm water, 3 miles in diameter, directly above the Mariana Trench. As the team's marine biologist, I was fascinated by the complete absence of life within the circle. No fish, no plankton, nothing registering on our equipment. Just crystal clear water heated to precisely 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, human body temperature. We should collect samples, I told Captain Reeves, already preparing collection containers. Headquarters wants us to move on, he replied, showing me the message on his tablet. They're sending another team with specialized equipment. Something in his tone seemed off. I'd worked with Reeves for years, and he'd never been one to back down from discovery. That night, I found him staring at the water, whispering to himself. When I approached, he was startled and claimed he was just tired. The next morning, Reeves was gone. His cabin was empty except for a note. "It's growing. I need to see." Security footage showed him walking calmly off the deck into the water at 3:17 a.m. We initiated search protocols, but I knew we wouldn't find him. The anomaly had expanded overnight, now nearly 4 miles across. 2 more crew members disappeared the following night. Both left similar notes about needing to see. The remaining crew grew paranoid, refusing to go near the railings. We decided to abandon the research mission and return to port. As communications officer, Maria sent our emergency return request. She suddenly stopped mid-sentence. "Do you hear that?" she asked, removing her headset. I heard nothing, but Maria's eyes widened. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "Like singing, but more." Before I could stop her, she walked woodenly to her cabin, returning with a small knife. "I need to see," she said, and began cutting a circular pattern into her forearm. I sedated her and confined her to the medical bay, but by morning, she had somehow escaped. Another body lost to the mysteriously warm water. The anomaly was now over 5 miles wide and growing faster. We were directly in its path with no way to outrun its expansion. That night, I locked myself in my cabin, desperate to stay awake. I heard scratching at my door, not the frantic scratching of someone trying to get in, but methodical, almost rhythmic, like a message being carved into the metal. When I checked the security camera, I saw 3 of my remaining crewmates standing outside my door, cutting identical circular patterns into their skin. Their eyes were blank, heads tilted, as if listening to something only they could hear. By dawn, I was the only one left on the ship. The anomaly now surrounded the Demeter warm, clear water stretching to the horizon in all directions. And for the first time, I could see what lay beneath. The trench below had been transformed into a vast spiral pattern, descending farther than should be possible. White shapes moved within the spiral, human figures swimming downward, including my missing crewmates. They moved in perfect synchronization, their pale bodies forming living circles within the larger pattern. As I watched, the spiral began to rotate, slowly at first, then faster. The water around the ship started to drain downward as if someone had pulled a cosmic plug. I felt the pull too, not on my body, but on my mind. A gentle tugging that promised answers, secrets, communion with something vast and ancient. I found myself at the railing, staring down at the spiral. At its center, where the trench should have ended, was a perfectly round darkness. Not the darkness of depth, but of something impossibly black against the illuminated water. It was opening, widening as the spiral spun faster. And from within that opening came a sound just at the edge of my hearing. The singing Maria had described. I understood then. The circle wasn't the anomaly. We were. All of us. All of humanity. Temporary irregularities in a pattern that had existed long before us. The ship began to tip as the water's rotation increased. I grabbed my research notes and the ship's logs, sealed them in a watertight container, and attached the emergency beacon. As I prepared to join my crewmates in the spiral, I took one last look at the container bobbing away on the surface, the only evidence we had ever existed. The blackness at the center of the spiral expanded, revealing glimpses of somewhere else, a place of impossible geometry, where massive shapes moved in ways that hurt my eyes to perceive. I stepped over the railing, feeling the perfect 98.6-degree water embrace me. The spiral pulled me downward, toward the center where my crewmates circled, their bodies forming symbols in the deep. As I descended, I realized why the water was body temperature. It wasn't water anymore. We were swimming in the blood of something unimaginably large, something that had finally awakened. Cargo ships don't just disappear in the North Atlantic. That's what I told the Lloyds of London representative when he hired me to investigate the vanishing of the Meridian Star and its 15-member crew. There's no trace of wreckage, no distress signals, and the weather was clear, he explained. It's as if it sailed into another dimension. I laughed, but he didn't. 3 ships had vanished in the same 50-mile radius over the past year. My job was to find out why. You're not the first investigator we've sent, he admitted as I was leaving his office. I turned back, one hand on the doorknob. The others? I asked. He merely shook his head and looked down at his desk. They reported initial findings. Then communications ceased. Their vessels were found adrift, empty. I should have walked away then. Instead, I convinced myself this was why they were paying me triple my usual rate. Risk and reward. I chartered a small vessel and a pilot named Haskell, a weathered man with one glass eye who barely spoke. We reached the disappearance zone on a crisp autumn morning with unusually flat seas. Won't find anything, Haskell muttered, the first words he'd spoken all day. The fog takes them. What fog? I asked. The sky was clear. Haskell tapped his glass eye. Doesn't come from the sky. As if on cue, The water 30 yards to our starboard began to bubble, as if boiling. Within seconds, a thick, yellowish mist rose from the churning sea, spreading across the water. With unnatural speed. "Told you," Haskell said, immediately turning the boat away. "Too late now." The fog enveloped us before we could escape, reducing visibility to mere feet. The air turned humid and smelled of rotting seaweed and something else. Something metallic and organic at once, like blood and copper. Our instruments went haywire, compass spinning, radar showing the phantom objects appearing and disappearing around us. The engine sputtered and died. "Don't touch the water," Haskell warned, his voice tight with fear. "Don't touch the fog if you can help it." I was about to ask what he meant when we heard it. The massive hull of a ship emerging from the fog barely 20 feet away. I recognized it immediately from the photographs. The Meridian Star. But something was wrong. The ship's metal hull was pitted and corroded, as if it had been underwater for decades, not months. And growing from those corroded patches were strange, bulbous formations. Organic-looking protrusions that pulsed slightly in the dim light. "We need to board it," I said, already preparing our small inflatable. "There might be survivors." Haskell grabbed my arm with surprising strength. "Those aren't survivors over there," he hissed. "Look closer." Squinting through the fog, I could make out movement on the deck. Hunched figures moving in jerky, uncoordinated motions. They seemed to be changing, their bodies warping and stretching in impossible ways. One figure turned toward us, and I felt my stomach lurch. The face was half dissolved, features sliding across what had once been human skin. But the eyes, God, the eyes were intact and aware, filled with a terrible pleading. I recognized him from the crew photos. Captain Richards, a 30-year veteran of the seas. His mouth opened in what might have been a scream, but what emerged was a gurgling sound followed by a spray of yellow mist. "What's happening to them?" I whispered. "The fog isn't a weather condition," Haskell said. "It's alive. It repurposes things." As if triggered by his words, a tendril of fog separated from the main mass and drifted deliberately toward our boat. When it touched the metal railing, the surface immediately began to corrode and bubble. "It's trying to board us," I realized with horror. The tendril formed a vaguely humanoid shape, reaching out with appendages that might have once been fingered, but were now elongated and fused, dripping with yellowish fluid. Haskell reached beneath his seat and pulled out a flare gun. "Fire breaks the connection," he said, firing directly into the fog creature. The flare passed through the mist, but left a dissipating hole in its wake. The creature recoiled, its form destabilizing momentarily. Taking advantage of the distraction, Haskell managed to restart the engine. We began to pull away, but the fog pursued us, flowing over the water's surface with deliberate intent. "Why are you here?" I shouted at Haskell as we fled. "You knew about this." His glass eyes seemed to gleam with its light. "Someone has to document it," he said. "Someone has to warn the others." The fog was gaining on us, tendrils reaching for our wake. Through the thinning mist behind us, I could see the Meridian Star more clearly now, and the other ships beside it, their hulls fused in a grotesque patchwork of metal and organic matter. And moving among them, the transformed crew members, no longer recognizably human, their bodies elongated and twisted, extra limbs sprouting from torsos, faces melted and reformed into something new. "They're becoming a colony," Haskell said, following my gaze. "The fog is just the reproductive stage." We escaped the perimeter of the fog bank, but I knew we hadn't escaped what we'd seen. Haskell handed me a waterproof journal filled with detailed drawings of the fog creatures and their victims, observations spanning decades. "Now you're the witness," he said, removing his glass eye to reveal not an empty socket, but a small, pulsing yellow mass. "When I'm gone, you'll need to find the next one." As yellow tendrils began to spread across his weathered face, I realized with horror that Haskell had never escaped the fog at all. He had simply become its messenger. I jumped overboard, swimming desperately toward a passing fishing vessel I spotted in the distance. Behind me, Haskell and our boat were engulfed in a swirling yellow mist that rose from his transforming body. The fishing boat rescued me, but I know it's only temporary. The yellow spot on my hand where the water touched me is spreading slowly. I'm running out of time to warn others. Sometimes at night, I hear whispers, not from outside, but from within the infection itself. It speaks of ancient things stirring in oceanic trenches, of a hunger that predates humanity. The fog, it tells me, is just the breathing of something far larger awakening below. I've locked myself in this coastal motel room, spreading Haskell's journals across the walls, connecting patterns he couldn't see. Ships have been disappearing for centuries, not just the three Lloyds knew about. All around the world, in carefully chosen locations, forming a pattern across the globe's oceans. When the pattern is complete, something changes. I've sent copies of my findings to every maritime authority, but the yellow stain has reached my forearm now. Last night, I woke to find my right hand had reshaped itself while I slept, fingers elongated, webbing between them, skin becoming translucent. I can feel the hunger growing, the need to return to the water, to become part of the colony. The fog isn't just in that 50-mile radius anymore. It's spreading. And through my infected hand, I can feel others like me. Messengers scattered across the world's oceans, small colonies disguised as survivors, waiting for the moment when the true transformation begins. Stay away from the fog. Stay away from the water. Stay away from people like me, because we're not the infection. We're the symptom, and the patient is about to wake up.